our guest speaker soon. So I'm joined by my colleague Amanda today and our guest speaker Suzanne Wall, who will be giving the talk. So just a few housekeeping bits. Sorry, there we go. Just a few housekeeping bits before we start. So if it's all right, if everyone could please keep themselves on mute during the talk, but at the end, there will be a Q&A where you can raise your hand using the Zoom function, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. You can also put any questions in the chat, either at the end or during the talk, and we will read out all the questions that are in the chat at the end. So the talk today will be recorded, but not the Q&A. And then it will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if hopefully there are no technical issues for anyone, but if there are, we will have it on our YouTube channel. And as I said in the chat, if anyone can't hear us, please do message and we will do everything we can to help with that. So now I am really delighted to introduce Suzanne Wall to give a talk about Camborne's rag trade and exploring what women would have been wearing in Camborne and where their clothes were made. So this online talk links with our current exhibition, Who, What, Where, Stories of the Women Behind Red Ruth's Rag Trade, which Suzanne very kindly helped with. So Suzanne was born in Camborne and has always taken a keen interest in the history of her hometown. She can remember visiting the 3 main department stores and collecting stories and photographs from her family. So some of her school friends worked in shops and industries associated with the making and sale of clothes in Camborne. She trained as a teacher, studying history and visual arts, and is now retired. So she did a part-time textile course at Cornwall College some years ago, and a final project was on the textiles of Henry Moore. So she loves knitting and quilting and all kinds of other craft projects. And she became really interested in this topic when Janet Axton asked her to help with some research on women's clothing and drapery shops in Camborne. So it's been really lovely working with Suzanne. She's been an amazing help with the current exhibition we have on. And also she's been looking into the history of Heathcote's fabrics, both here and in Tiverton, which if you've not seen the exhibition already and do live in Cornwall, it's a wonderful case on Heathcotes. And the last day for our exhibition is this weekend. So thank you very much. And I really can't wait for this online talk. There's got some really amazing images in it. So I will now pass over to our speaker, Suzanne Wall.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Some of you from quite a long way away, I see. It's going to be something of a whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid, of the fashion industry in Camborne over the last roughly about sort of 200 years. Now, why did you choose what you are wearing today, and who made your clothes? Because what we wear shapes our identity, and today most of our clothes are made abroad. It's difficult to trace where they were made, who made them, and how ecologically sound our choices are. What's your particular, your earliest memory of a particular item of clothing? Can you remember a favorite dress or a pair of shoes? Or in my case, there was a hated nylon swimsuit of that clingy, bubbly variety, or that school beret. And what did you like or dislike about them? Did you like the style? Did you like the feel of the fabric? Maybe that swish of all those layered petticoats? Were they comfortable to wear? The Crescent Kerno exhibition, Stories of the Women Behind the Reduced Rag Trade, demonstrate how women were involved in the making and selling of clothes in Redruth. I would like to continue this theme by looking at the rag trade in Camborne and what choices women had in what they wore. Now, what options did women have in the different social classes in Camborne in the 19th and early 20th century? Dress is almost always an indicator of status and wealth, and clothing was key to identifying you and told everything about you, the wearer, perhaps your occupation. Dressmakers and milliners didn't just make clothing for customers, but refashioned their identities through the manipulation of a few yards of cloth or ribbon or lace or buttons, and that essential item in a women's wardrobe, the corset. My main focus will be the increasing choices for the majority of women in the emerging middle classes and their role in the production and selling of clothes. Right, the first slide, please. Right, Lady Frances Susanna Bassett by Thomas Gainsborough. The Bassets were the top of the social scale in this area, with their country seat at Tahiti House, not far from Camborne. And their clothes would have been tailor-made to fit them. They would have chosen to have their clothes made in a location of fashion, probably somewhere such as London or Bath. And fabrics and adornments, as you can see, would have included silk, satin, velvet, pearls, lace, feathers. Undergarments would have been linen, silk, muslin, or cambric. Next slide, please. Now, these two photographs show, firstly, a woman and child on the left associated with the survey of Camborne, commissioned by Sir Richard Vivian in 1850. At that time, the Vivians of Trellawarren owned roughly 3/4 of the town. Note the names and the streets and the pub. And the surveyor was so appalled by the conditions he found, he wrote a letter to the Royal Cornwall Gazette in June 1852, and it makes interesting but disturbing reading. And you can see she's wearing an apron, a head covering, and her skirt is some kind of striped fabric with something around the another decoration around near the hem. Now, the lady the woman on the right is a Newlyn fishwife, and I really liked her shawl. If you take a good look at her shawl, this is why I've included this photograph, you can see she has some lovely patterned fringing to the edge of the shawl. And if you look closely, you'll see a little tiny patch on her right shoulder. So obviously she's torn that precious shawl at some time, but has patched it with a little bit of fabric to extend its use. So the lower classes, like these two women, dressing would have been a skirt and a blouse, a dress, a shawl, maybe a pinafore, a head covering of some kind, and laced boots or clogs. And garments would have been handed down from generation to generation. Handmade, mended, patched, bought secondhand, or obtained from charity. And clothing could also have been used as a kind of currency, being pawned or rented or sold. Hard choices had to be made. In which order would you put clothes or food or rent or fuel? Next slide, please. Now, this is quite a famous photograph of the bell maidens working at Dulcoath Mine in the 1890s, wearing those very distinguishable gook bonnets. Dangerous working conditions in the mines made many women widows, and they received no recompense from the mine owners. On Christmas Eve 1863, the Bassets arranged for wheat, flour, and beef, linsey woolsey, a coarse twill made of linen and wool, these linsey woolsey dresses, and 1 shilling to be distributed to 350 widows. And I sort of wonder how many of these women here maybe were widows, or maybe went to Tahiti House to get those there's handouts from the Bassett family. And late Christmas Eve saw widows walking up to the Dehiddy Mansion Drive, some with wheelbarrows, and they could choose either a coat, a blanket, or 100 weight of coal. Thank you. Next slide. Another dress of uniform was the domestic servant, and they had an instantly recognizable uniform of their own, which denoted both conformity and differentiation. Bowel maidens were recognizable by their traditional protective clothing, and those gook bonnets would help shield the wearer from the sun, flying debris, and noise. And in fact, in 1841 census, Camborne census, there were 749 women and children working at the mines. Now, these uniforms, there's a cook on the right and the housemaid on the left. I particularly noticed the lovely pinafore that the housemaid was wearing with the lace at the top. Now, this uniform would have been the servants who would have been seen. Unfortunately, most of the clothing of the working classes has not survived, and we can only see it in photographs. And clothes were patched, mended, cut down for younger generations, and then used as rags for patchwork or rugs. Next slide, please. The Reduth Union Workhouse, now Camborne Reduth Hospital at Barncuse, was a last resort for many of the poor and the ill. The Poor Law Commissioners anticipated that union workhouse inmates would actually make their own clothes, which I think was rather optimistic of them, providing a useful work task as well as saving cost. They totally failed to realize the skill required to make even a simple calico shift. Therefore, uniforms were more likely to be bought in. Now, this is the Poor Law Ledger, which is held here at Crescent-Carno. And you can see that there is an Elizabeth Pierce of Camborne, who was given a blanket and 3 yards of calico in 1825. But by 1826, a purpose had to be given for the giving of the cloth. And she had 3 yards of baize, it's a coarse woolen or cotton fabric for an undercoat, and 3 yards of calico for a shift. Well, I hope Elizabeth Pierce of Camborne had some experience of making clothes and possessed the means of cutting the calico and the baize, and had a needle and thread for putting the garments together. Thank you. Next slide. Now, this is a photograph of, as it says, Nicky Penrose, who lived at Reduth Union Workhouse around 1906. I at first rather jumped to the conclusion, looking at this photograph, that was perhaps his family gathered around him. It could quite well have been, but we don't know. They're reasonably well dressed and with white smocks, were kind of pinafore, which covered more expensive, possibly dresses, blouses, that kind of thing. And I noticed that the lady on the right is even wearing a little brooch at her neck. In front of them sits a wheelbarrow. And in that wheelbarrow, it's a sort of jumble of some kind of cloth. Could be a blanket or maybe some clothes. Thank you. Next slide. The emerging middle classes. As the country became industrialized, women only had a few outfits, but they did dress relatively well. Many women sewed, knitted, embellished, and mended at home. Sewing was done by hand or later with a sewing machine, which was invented around the 1850s. Mass production of sewing machines, as well as the invention of synthetic dyes, introduced major changes. And here we have a magazine. The advancement in printing produced a proliferation of magazines advertising the latest trends in high fashion. Now, this shows the marriage of Miss Trelawney to Mr. Arthur Bassett of Tahiti at Truro Cathedral in 1898. It's an article with detailed description of the dresses, and the photo appeared in the penny illustrated paper. Models, which actually are not really that much like Miss Trelawney, and certainly not like Lady Trelawney, but the bride's dress with a court train, which you can see on the left, was ivory white satin, Honiton lace, silk, muslin, and chiffon, with sprays of orange blossoms. And on the right, you have her going away outfit. Again, the waists defy belief, really, but day wear for the majority of women was practical, with dress and scarf, but an occasional evening dress for parties could be added to their wardrobe. Attending church services and events was another opportunity to wear one's best clothes. Next slide, please. I'll look briefly at two items of clothing which proved essential to looking one's best and also achieving the right silhouette. The first is hats, and later I'll be talking a little bit about corsets. Now, this lovely photograph is of the Camborne Bible Christian Chapel tea treat, and an occasion for very splendid headwear, including those lovely little children sitting in the front row. Absolutely magnificent hats. And for women, hats kept their hair in place. They kept the dust and the dirt out. Frequent hair washing was not an option for the majority. And the Edwardian age really saw hats reach their most opulent. They became wider, more elaborate, festooned with dried flowers, fruit, leaves, bows, lace, feathers, sometimes, sadly, whole stuffed birds, and even a squirrel. Plumage and stuffed bird use was so extensive that laws had to be passed to protect them, and Queen Victoria even banned feathered hats from court after much public criticism. Next slide, please. I've included this one because I actually love it. I love those girls at the front with their magnificent hats. In the background, you've got men doing the very important job of laying the foundation stone of Plantation Chapel. But the girls have turned towards the photographer, and you can see those wonderful hats that they're wearing. Next slide, please. Now, this is a photograph of a wedding in Trelawney Road in Camborne. And my grandmother is in the front row, second from the left. She's in the photograph because her brother, who was at the back, was going out with the sister of the bride. Now, that's certainly a magnificent array of hats. In fact, the bride it looks a little insignificant. She's got a large bouquet of flowers, but as for her headwear, it really doesn't compare with that array of hats in evidence around her. Now, I took a photograph of the photograph and put it into my computer. And if I could have the next slide. I zoomed in closer to have a look at those hats. And standing next to my great uncle is a woman who looks like she's got two enormous ostrich feathers secured with a huge brooch into her hat. And you can also see some other quite magnificent hats there on display in that photograph. Interestingly, that house was bought by my parents about 70 years later, having no idea that these photographs were taken there until my grandmother found the photographs and told them, said that was the house where I was a bridesmaid all those years ago. So quite a coincidence. Next slide, please. Now, Camborne had some posh shops, and Mode de Paris a shop specializing in French and English millinery and clothing and run by Madame Jewel. So you can see the shop there. I'm afraid I have no idea where it is, and I've asked extensively. I would love to be able to find it. I'm sure all the fancy trimmings would have long gone, but that's the kind of shop that Camborne had at the end of the 19th century. Next slide, please. And another photograph of the same shop with some very smartly dressed shop girls who would have probably had quite a tough job. They would have worked very long hours, and they would have probably been standing for most of that time. You can see the windows is absolutely full of goods, but I would really love to know where that shop was. Next slide, please. Now, straw bonnet making was a cottage industry, mainly in the hands of women and children. Originally, plaiting the straw was done by hand, a very long and tedious process. But in the 1870s, the market was flooded with cheap imported plaits from China and Japan. And in one of the directories for Camborne, Slater's 1852 to 1853, the directory lists 10 straw bonnet makers in Camborne. Now, these are bowl maidens in straw hats in the early 1900s. They don't seem to have quite the same protection level against flying dirt, the sun, and the rain, and perched quite precariously on top of their heads, some of them. But they're wearing those white aprons were worn for the photograph. They would have been replaced by Hessian ones, often potato sacks. They were called towsers, and they wore these when they were working. They would wind rags around their hands with the thumbs sticking out to protect them as they wielded those long handled shovels and picks and hammers. Next, please. Now, this is my grandmother, and she's wearing a rather large dyed straw hat. So hats could, particularly with the advent of synthetic dyes, hats could be dyed quite a number of colours. But what also struck me about this photograph is that Granny is wearing a watch. Now, this was taken certainly just before or around the time of the First World War. So fairly unusual for women to be wearing wristwatches, but her brother was a jeweler and watchmaker, so that probably explains it. Right, I'm now going to go on to the censors and directories for Camborne. The national census and trade directories are an invaluable source of information concerning people's occupations and the comparative wealth of a town. Camborne and Redruth were affluent towns during the mining boom and were at the centre of one of the richest tin mining areas in the world. And in the Camborne census of 1841, there were 115 dressmakers. The directories, and please note that you had to pay to be in a directory. So these were paid entries, and they show an all-female workforce in dressmaking and millinery. In Kelly's directory of 1883 of Camborne, there were 17 milliners, 12 dressmakers, and 1 stay and corset maker. Only Falmouth and Truro had more. Kelly's 1926, there were 4 milliners. Kelly's 1930, there were 2 milliners. And by 1935, there was just one, Miss Ada Temby of 43 Twellowan Street. Shops and factory-produced clothing had closed down virtually all independent home milliners except Miss Temby in those official directories. Now, new shops were springing up, such as a Berlin wool warehouse, wool tapestry, run by Mrs. Anna and Ellie Phillips in Cross Street. Fancy repositories or fancy drapers were prominently run by women and sold haberdashery, patterns, and much more. Nothing was pre-cut, everything cut to order, elastic, ribbons, trimmings, fabric, etc. They were an overpacked treasure trove for home sewers, including Miss Mahala Whitford of Bassett Road, and many people remember Mrs. Dorothy Besence of Cross Street. A Camborne worker once told me that she moved from factory to factory for better pay, and she remembers buying all her clothes from her father's 2 catalogues. This is something I hadn't really thought about, that these catalogues were a source of clothing which could be paid for month by month. And this woman bought her clothes from her father, who ran Great Universal and Empire stores, and she paid him 2 and 6 a month. Kay's was founded in 1889 and was purchased by Great Universal in 1937. Empire Stores introduced its first mail order catalogue in 1890, which I think was much earlier than I imagined. The clothing was increasingly factory made and sold in large, fixed-priced department stores. And Camborne had 3 very large fashion department stores. And we start with Vivian's. This was the largest commercial property in Camborne. It was in Bassett Road, demolished in 1985 because of the dangerous state of the building, and is now Trevithick Surgery. It was established in 1839 and rebuilt on a truly monumental scale in 1897. Plans by Sylvanus Travail can be seen here at Crescent-Carno. The British Newspaper Archive can give us a great deal of information about local news and shop advertisements. If we could go back briefly to the previous slide, that's it, the Whitsuntide exhibition of latest fashions. And in the Cornubian and Redruth Times of June 1905, Vivian's is now being referred to as an emporium. The model demonstrates the desirable silhouette achieved by wearing what was known as the S-curve or swanbill, or it was even called the health corset. It was thought to be healthier as it put less pressure on the front of the abdomen and promoted a proud posture. However, not surprisingly, it was later found to be quite damaging to the spine. But the advertisement contains a wealth of information on which fabrics were popular at the time. And I had to look up some of these. The Holland costumes and the Aeolienne was a kind of brocade. The feather boas and stoles, sadly often made of animal fur. Unmade robes, I think, were a comfortable kind of dressing gown or a dress to be worn at home, perhaps in the Japanese kimono style, which was becoming very popular and adopted for its comfort from the end of the 19th century. I mean, I think I've been quite glad to have got out of that dress myself into something known as an unmade robe. Next slide, please. So there we are, lots of departments in the store, huge store, and I can remember going there to visit Father Christmas many years ago. Where are we with the slides? Yes, this is the Cornish Post and Mining News, and they invite a visit of inspection, which would be greatly appreciated. I remember my grandmother shopping there, and she would say she'd be welcomed into the store and given a seat. They would then bring out lots of coats and dresses and things for her to have a look at. She would select from, she'd make her choice, and they would send them home to her. So she had then tried them on at home. It was called having them on approval or on APRO. And then the ones she didn't want, she simply sent back to the shop and paid for the ones that she did. Now that's a photograph of Vivian's shop being absolutely full of goods. It really was packed full of well, everything, every sort and kind of thing you could think of clothes-wise. Now, the next slide, please. This is the second big department store, Berryman Brothers. Now, it was an early photograph taken before the fire of 1906, in which sadly 2 young shop girls lost their lives. Bessie Kent, aged 19, and Ada Trelaw was only just 14. So it just shows how young some of these sales assistants were. The windows are stuffed with goods, and items for sale are even displayed on the pavement. Slide 20.
Apologies, I think we're having a few technical issues. Is the slides okay?
Yeah, no, we're back. That's fine. That's fine. Now, this is Berryman's staff do in the 1970s. Short, mainly plain dresses, but a distinctive diamond patterned one there in the front. Colour and fabric, we don't know. Very little jewellery apart from brooches. Next slide. Now, Berryman's updating its signage. So this would be sort of cutting edge sign in the late 50s, early 1960s. So Henry H. Berryman, Draper and Milliner, who's at Trelawney Street, now Smith's. The shop opened in 1860, advertising the sale of dresses, jackets and millinery. Departments were on several levels and the shop went back through to 4th Street. The Cornish Post and Mining News of May 1926 says, having just returned from London, Berryman's advertising a large variety of newest goods in all departments, ready-to-wear garments, 2-piece costumes, coats, etc. And the third department store, next slide. Now, many people will probably remember this because it went on much longer than the others. And that's an early photograph of Hugh Rice and Sons, Church Street. It burnt down in 1997 and is now the Aldi stores in Camborne. And Mr. Khan, the manager, would greet customers at the door and assign a sales assistant to help them. January sales were genuine, and there were queues waiting on the doorstep for the shop to open. It was packed with goods. Next slide, please. That's the interior. Wonderful photograph they have here at Crescent-Carno. I mean, notice that awkward pricing. A towel would have cost you 3 and 11 halfpenny, of course, pre-decimalisation. And Mr. Khan would regularly be summoned to check the adding up on bills. And their money would be put into a little carriage and sent on a wire up to the office. My sister had a holiday job in the underwear department, sewing on card labels with handwritten prices, 2 French knots on each one. She says she was able to do French knots in her sleep. Rice's would also undertake made-to-measure dressmaking. A former customer told me you would choose by the pattern and fabric, and that was quite cheap. No deposit was needed for the making. You paid when you collected the garment. Next slide, please. Christmas at Rice's. Another newspaper advertisement for Rice's in 1912, they begged to announce a magnificent range of dress materials. Miss Kevin has just returned from London with the Sunshine Girl hat. She's prepared to embody the most artistic and becoming West End styles at economic prices. So obviously the race was on between Vivian's, Berryman's and Rice's to attract customers with their new London collections. And said Christmas Eve was celebrated in style. A small organ here has been brought in. The player is in fancy dress, Queen of Hearts, I think, and the playing of live festive music. Next slide, please. Right, we move on again. Berryman's has updated its sign once more. And we're looking now at Cornish silks, which catered for the more expensive end of the market. Next slide, please. Stocking well-known names such as Dorita, Horrocks's, Charles Butler, and Eastex. Next slide, please. Again, these impossible waistlines. They also sold wedding dresses, hand-knitted sweaters from Ireland, and golf wear. A lot of people playing golf at the Tahiti golf course. The owner, Mr. DeVoe, had been a silk printer at St. Ives for the famous company of Crusade. I talked to a sales assistant who had worked there age 16 from 1950 to 1954. She said the clothes were beautiful, the best quality you could buy. She did window dressing and carried packages to the Western National bus stop to hand them to the drivers, who would then take them to the store in another branch. She said, I loved opening new stock. Dress alterations were done by 3 dressmakers. There was only a manageress and me, and I could only have a reduced item at Christmas, which was a blouse, and I was paid £1, 5 shillings a week. Dorothy Perkins came to town. It was the first really modern clothes shop in town, Trelawarne Street, opposite the Midland Bank. Wasn't able to find a picture of it. It was next to Tom Moore's, it was on the corner, but it was a little bit obscured. Next slide, please. Dinions. Now, Dinions really created quite a storm when it came to the town because it was such a modern boutique with good quality and height of fashion clothes. It was at the bottom of Cross Street, which is now a cycle shop. I'd love to have that in colour, because I'm sure those clothes were orange, purple, green, lime green, all those really, really bright colours of the 70s. Both Dinions and Dorothy Perkins had models for their clothes to wear at the town's shopping week, which first took place in the 1950s and later was part of Camborne Festival programme. Holman's Engineering Factory would host the fashion show. Hair was by Pat and Michael. In fact, I used to have my hair cut there many years ago, and the clothes were by Dinions. Now we move on to factories in Camborne where clothes were made. Phyllis Hoskins set up a knitting factory in Troon in the 1950s. She returned to Cornwall from London to take up a contract with Vivian's Outfitters to do alterations for the ladies' clothes department. With no electricity at home, she purchased a treadle sewing machine on hire purchase from Singer. She had a friend still living in London who asked if she thought of making underwear out of parachute material. She decided to have a go and was soon selling sets of underwear faster than she could make them through a friend working at the Climax Engineering Company, as no war coupons were needed to buy them. She started a knitting enterprise by making Argyle socks for export and then bought flatbed machines to make jumpers. The factory was an old barn behind Troon Post Office. Machines were powered by electricity, and eventually 18 staff were taken on. Then she opened a shop on the corner of Union Street, Cross Street, is now a Vet's, selling wool and knitwear. Then moved to a prime site in Trelawarne Street opposite Woolworths. Next slide, please. Jaquemand Limited. The firm came from Bradford at the end of the Second World War to open a factory at Bridge near Redruth. Bridge between Portreath and Redruth. It's now the Williams factory. A smaller factory opened in Camborne at the bottom of Cross Street behind the Grenville bus stop. It was later a laundry and now a cafe. They produced ladies' suits and dresses. Cornishman headlines in 1948. Will Camborne Redruth men be workless? Snags in hoped-for development explained by officials to the Cornishmen. Women's employment more hopeful. At Bridge, Heathcoats have fallen easily into their lace and weaving work. Other employers, Langridge's and Jaquemand, all report the same. So there were lots of jobs going for women in the sewing industry. And you can see there the London designs created by their London house, but made by Cornish girls. Some memories from a former employee who started at the Camborne factory, age 15, says, there were 20 machinists. I made day dresses from a silky fabric which was slippery to work with, mainly the same pattern, but in different colours. There was a small shop next to the factory, and money was docked from my wages to buy something from the shop. I left to work at Langridge's because the pay was better. I made a lot of my own clothes, and I shared a favourite paper pattern with a friend. I just kept changing the neckline and the sleeves. Next slide, please. Our big factory that came to Camborne was Langridge's, and it came to Camborne in 1946. It had been an underwear factory based in Bristol, specialising in corsets. So I will briefly return to the subject of corsets, the indispensable garment, the corset. They were worn by women of all classes, and not wearing a corset was associated with loose morals, certainly by the Victorians. It was such an essential garment that it was even issued to women in prison and in the workhouse. In 1837, at a workhouse in Staffordshire, women were supplied with baracan, that's a thick, coarse fabric, at £1 a yard, wood at 7p a set, and stay laces, 4p a dozen. They could make stays. Prison corsets were often made of leather. Working women, such as domestic servants, could purchase something like the pretty housemaid corset, marketed as strong and cheap. Or if you could not afford to buy even the cheapest, there were plenty of dressmaking text on how to make your own using buckram, cut stays, and a strong thread called stay silk. And there was even a maternity corset. Corsets also denoted class. If you had a tightly laced appearance created by more constrictive corsetry, the message was you could not possibly be associated with the working class activities involving any menial labour. When corsets, often called jumps, were worn loosely, it meant you needed the freedom to work. Now, corset technology is a subject in its own right. Whalebone or metal stays, laces or slot and stud fastenings, satin, cotton, man-made stretch fabric trimmed with hand embroidery or machine-made lace. And what did you do with your corset when you took it off at the end of the day? Throw it over a chair or roll it up into a beautifully embroidered corset bag? Corset bags are another area of research I discovered, but no time for here. And back to Camborne, the Langridge factory. Next slide, please. The first Langridge factory was in the old council offices in the Trevenson Street, corner of Trevenson Street and Cross Street, now sadly derelict. It became too small as the business expanded, and in 1960 there were 100 machinists producing 1,200 bras a week. So a purpose-built factory was erected at the end of Veen Road. Still there, it's now a heating firm. The local MP opened the new factory in 1962 by cutting the ribbon, a bra strap, of course. Mr. E.J. Sheriff, managing director of Langridge's Bristol, told the Cornishman on the 8th of August 1946 that he aimed eventually to employ 100 to 150 Camborne district girls on pleasant, congenial work under most modern conditions. They would start in a small way due to the short supply of machinery. 6 or more girls would be trained in Bristol. Pay for learners would be 1 shilling and halfpenny an hour, and for piecework, when trained, 1 shilling and 4p. And Mr. Sheriff remarked, the girls he'd seen at the Camborne Labour Exchange were a very fine type indeed. If I can employ those girls and younger girls from school of their capability, my firm has come to stay in Camborne. And there is an advertisement for skilled sewing machinists. Now, satin and ribbon belong to the past, giving way to new fabrics such as nylons, spandex, power net, and power lace. No longer referred to as stays or corsets, it was now foundation wear. Next slide, please. Machinists started at a basic rate and then went on to piecework. Trainees would watch a film played on a loop and projected onto a small screen in front of them, showing them techniques demonstrated by an experienced seamstress. The working day was 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with a half hour for lunch. Bras were made for Marks and Spencer, Evans Outsize, British Home Stores, and Littlewoods. M&S bras had to be sewn 12 stitches to the inch. One supervisor said they had to be perfect, and I mean perfect. If a mistake was made, the label was cut out and the item sold elsewhere as flawed stock. Women were able to earn a good wage, sometimes equal to what their fathers were earning. An article in the West Briton in September 1965 said girls at Langridge's factory work on piece rates and take home an average pay packet of nearly £9 a week, in some cases as much as their fathers earn. 3 girls earned £12 and 6 earned £11. And if you were really good, you could earn as much as £13, 19 shillings and 5p. Former employees made the following observations. Leaving school, I worked there for 3 years, 1960 to 1963, double stitching around the top of bras. Brian Sheriff, the manager, was a good manager to work for. I worked a treadle sewing machine. My sister worked there for 7 to 8 years, but left to go to Heathcote's. Women moved around quite a lot, actually, as the pay was better at different factories. They would move from one to another. Someone else said, mother and aunt did outwork from Veen Road on an old Singer, threading bra clips on machine and stitching hooks on elastic at back. She remembers yards of thick white cotton and the regular short buzz of the machine in the next room. And a mother and 2 daughters in Victoria Street would take in corsets and sit around the tables, snipping off all the loose threads. Next slide, please. I would just like to finish really with some personal history and about really learning to look. Maybe adopting a slower approach to looking at photographs. Unfortunately, I don't have any garments belonging to my grandparents or great-grandparents, which have been really lovely to have been able to have looked at. But real looking cannot be accomplished with just a quick glance. Now, 2 of my maternal great-grandmothers were both born in the year 1873, and this is Bessie. Bessie lived at St. Day and worked at the fuse factory there. This photograph was taken by Opie of Redruth. She's wearing a very plain dress with a lace collar. Perhaps something she'd knitted herself. And I always think it a shame that the photographer didn't point out that actually she's got her collar hooked up over her left shoulder. Do you think he would have said, we'll just make sure your collar is sitting nicely, because that was obviously her pride and joy at the time. Maybe it was her wedding dress. I don't know. Photos were taken at key moments in people's lives. And she was 31 when she married a 22-year-old tin miner. It's the only photograph I have of her as a young woman. 2 later ones as an elderly woman. She's wearing a pinafore. And I became quite interested in pinafores, a much loved garment. Could we have the next one, please? Now, Rosie, the other great-grandmother, was born in America. She was born of Cornish parents and returned to Gwynedd as a child. It is the only photograph I have of her. Unfortunately, it's a damaged copy. But looking closely, I see a very elaborate beaded collar with a little brooch at the front and some frilled sleeves. And she could obviously afford clothes that were just a little bit better and with some adornment. Unfortunately, it's quite damaged at the bottom, and I don't have the original of this photograph. Next slide, please. Now, my paternal grandmother was born in Penzance in 1893, and here she's wearing a heavy-duty single-breasted jacket with high neck lace blouse and a favourite necklace that appears in several photographs. Her hair is tied back with a large bow, and she really looks purposeful and ready to enter a changing and more commercial world. Next, please. Here she is again. A fairly plain layered outfit, obviously taken in a studio, but with decorative detail. If you can just see that corded belt, which these corded belts were influenced by the Japanese style of kimono belts. I think my grandmother actually was quite fashionable, and looking at the photographs of her, she seemed to go with a lot of the fashions of the time. Next, please. This is my final slide. And that's my grandmother on the right, sitting with her younger sister. And Granny's actually wearing her wedding dress. She married in 1918, and her husband immediately left to go back to the First World War for 2 years. He was a Camborne boy. I'm afraid her parents were not all that happy with the Penzance girl marrying a Camborne boy. They had a bit of a reputation. And the dress was obviously chosen to be worn again after the wedding. And I've actually got a hand-coloured wedding photograph, and the dress was a very pale blue. And I'd never noticed in that photograph before that she was actually wearing her wedding dress. So, in conclusion, I hope I've been able to sow some seeds of interest in the history of women's fashion and working life in my hometown. Maybe have another look at those family photographs. What do they tell you about the subject's choice of clothes? Maybe any details you've not noticed before. Were they party clothes, Sunday best, working clothes, hand-me-downs? Do they show status, record an important event, indicate a profession? What impact has the internet, the charity shop, had on our buying options in our high streets? Perhaps there's a small detail here which may have captured your imagination, perhaps for some further research yourselves. Corset bags, clothing repair, pinafores, women's wristwatches, knitted collars, beadwork, and so on. And we must capture those first-hand memories before they disappear forever. Now, I'm sure I've raised far more questions than answers, but thank you for joining me on this, just skimming the surface of Camborne's rag trade history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was amazing. It's just so interesting to hear all about the history of Camborne. Like, as you said, like the exhibition here is all about Red Ruth, and it's just so amazing to see that Camborne right next door, how that sort of history, is really part of that as well. And I loved seeing the photos of your family. I think it's so interesting to think about how to look at photos like really closely. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. So if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the chat. That's so nice. That's actually my
very kind, thank you.
That's so nice.
Thank you, Dave.